In a war defined by tanks and aircraft, Jack Churchill chose steel and wood. While the British Army retreated toward Dunkirk, he carried a broadsword and a longbow, not as symbols, but as tools. The question wasn't whether they looked absurd, but whether surprise could still win seconds that rifles could not. At 6:58 on May 29, 1940, Captain Jack Churchill lay behind a shattered farm wall outside a small French crossroads east of Dunkirk, watching a German patrol advance through low morning fog. He was 34 years old, commissioned more than a decade earlier. No confirmed combat kills. Around him, the British Expeditionary Force was collapsing toward the coast under relentless German pressure. France was falling fast. German armored units were driving west at a pace few British planners had imagined possible. Columns of exhausted infantry streamed north toward evacuation points. Trucks burned in roadside ditches. Equipment was abandoned to lighten loads. Officers destroyed documents they could not carry. Churchill did not discard anything. Across his back rested a 6-foot English longbow with a draw weight of roughly 70 pounds. At his hip hung a Scottish broadsword. Slung beside his rifle was a quiver of steel-tipped arrows. To many, it looked absurd, but Churchill had not brought the bow as a gesture. Less than a year earlier, he had competed internationally in archery. He was not a champion, but he was precise. At 50 yards, he could split a tight grouping on demand. At 200, he could still deliver a lethal shot in capable conditions. The German patrol moved closer, 5 men, disciplined spacing. The lead non-commissioned officer scanned hedges and upper windows for rifle barrels or machine gun nests. He was looking for muzzle flashes. He would not find one. At roughly 35 yards, Churchill made his decision. A rifle shot would reveal position instantly. The crack would echo across the fields and invite suppressive fire. An arrow would not. He rose slightly, set the shaft to string, and drew back to his anchor point. The same motion practiced thousands of times in training fields far from war. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to distance, wind, and tension in the string. He released. The arrow struck the German sergeant squarely in the chest. The man fell without a shout. The rest of the patrol froze, confused by the silent collapse of their leader. That hesitation, no more than a second or two, was enough. British rifles opened from concealed positions. The patrol scattered under sudden fire, disoriented and leaderless. 2 were hit before they could properly respond. The survivors retreated into the mist, dragging their wounded. The engagement lasted less than a minute. When it ended, Churchill recovered his arrow. It had done exactly what he intended. Remove command, create shock, and buy time without broadcasting his location. It was, by all credible accounts, the only confirmed longbow kill of the European war, and it occurred not because medieval weapons were superior, but because one officer understood that silence can be as decisive as firepower. Churchill's superiors had long regarded him as unconventional. He had graduated from Sandhurst in the mid-1920s, served in Burma, then resigned in peacetime boredom before rejoining at the outbreak of war. He had worked abroad, ridden motorcycles across Asia, acted in minor film roles, and cultivated skills few modern officers valued: archery, swordsmanship, and Highland bagpipes. Some considered him eccentric, others believed him unstable. But Churchill's reasoning was consistent. Modern rifles offered range and rate of fire. In close combat, however, shock and psychology still mattered. A silent kill could fracture cohesion. A sudden charge could overwhelm expectation. The retreat to Dunkirk would eventually extract over 300,000 Allied troops from the beaches between late May and early June. Most returned without heavy weapons. Many returned with nothing at all. Churchill returned with his bow, his sword, and a reputation beginning to take shape. He had covered the withdrawal of his men under pressure. He had demonstrated that unconventional tools, used deliberately, could still alter a tactical moment. Britain would soon stand alone, and Churchill was already preparing for a different kind of war, one that would not be fought from trenches or static lines, but from small boats, rocky coastlines, and enemy-held territory. The bow was only the beginning. By late summer 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The beaches of Dunkirk were behind them. German forces now occupied most of Western Europe, and invasion seemed not only possible, but probable. The British Army was rebuilding from near collapse, and inside the War Office a new idea was forming. If Britain could not match Germany division for division, it would strike differently. Small units, fast raids, precision violence, hit hard, withdraw fast, and force the enemy to defend every mile of coastline. They would be called Commandos. Jack Churchill volunteered immediately. The selection process was unforgiving. Candidates marched more than 20 miles a day across the Scottish Highlands, carrying full combat loads. They climbed cliffs, crossed freezing rivers, and conducted live-fire exercises with rounds passing overhead. Anyone who fell behind was returned to his original unit without ceremony. Churchill was older than many of the men attempting selection, but endurance favored him. He finished long marches upright. He showed no visible strain during cold water drills. On the range, his accuracy remained steady under fatigue. More important than physical performance was composure. Commando operations required initiative without panic, aggression without loss of control. Churchill fit the profile. He requested permission to bring his broadsword and longbow on future operations. Surprisingly, approval was granted. Commandos were volunteers operating outside conventional expectations. Individual initiative was encouraged if it produced results. Training intensified. Night landings from small craft into hostile shorelines. Demolition practice against fortified positions. Silent killing techniques using knives and garrots. Navigation across mountainous terrain in near total darkness. Churchill mastered each discipline. He treated modern weapons seriously. The Thompson submachine gun, grenades, demolition charges, but he did not abandon his unconventional tools. To skeptical recruits, he explained it simply. A rifle is expected, a sword is not. In close quarters, shock has value, surprise has value. A moment of hesitation can break resistance faster than sustained gunfire. By early 1941, he had risen to a leadership role within his commando unit. Responsibility now extended beyond his own survival. Every decision would determine whether dozens of men returned home. Then came orders for a significant operation along the Norwegian coast. The target was strategically important. A coastal position guarding shipping lanes vital to German logistics. Intelligence suggested reinforced defenses, artillery emplacements, machine gun nests, and trained garrison troops. The assault would occur at dawn in winter conditions. Naval bombardment would precede landing, but the final objective depended on infantry speed and precision. Churchill studied maps relentlessly in the days before departure. Terrain contours, elevation lines, likely machine gun arcs. He requested placement in the first assault wave. Permission was granted. On December 26, 1941, transport ships cut north through icy seas. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Ice formed along the rails. Below deck, men cleaned weapons and wrote letters home. Churchill prepared differently. He sharpened the edge of his broadsword, checked the tuning of his bagpipes, inspected grenades and ammunition. The bow would remain aboard for this mission. The terrain and tempo demanded automatic fire, but the sword would go ashore. Before dawn on December 28th, landing craft were lowered into black water. Churchill stood in the lead boat, exposed, sword secured at his side. Naval guns thundered overhead. Smoke drifted across the shoreline to obscure German sight lines. The ramp would drop within minutes. If the assault stalled, men would die in freezing surf under machine gun fire. If it succeeded, Britain would prove it could strike back. Churchill did not crouch behind steel plating like the others. He remained standing as the boat closed the final 100 yards toward the Norwegian coast. The age of retreat was over. This would be something else entirely. At 8:52 on December 28, 1941, the ramp of Churchill's landing craft slammed down onto a frozen strip of Norwegian shoreline. Naval shells were still detonating inland. Smoke drifted low across the rocks. German return fire had begun to adjust toward the surf. Churchill stepped into the freezing water first. He did not sprint. He moved forward at a controlled pace, bagpipes under one arm, broadsword at his side. The sound of naval artillery rolled across the fjord, and then another sound cut through it. Highland pipes. The tune carried across the beach in defiance of logic. German defenders, trained to expect crouched infantry and muzzle flashes, instead saw a British officer advancing upright through smoke with a sword visible at his hip. Confusion is a weapon. Churchill reached dry rock, finished the short refrain, set the pipes down behind cover, and drew steel. He signaled forward movement. His commandos surged past him, Thompsons firing in short, controlled bursts. The first German machine gun nest opened late, its fire scattered and poorly aimed. The crew had hesitated just long enough. Churchill closed the final yards to a forward trench line. A German gunner attempted to swing his weapon toward the advancing commandos. Churchill crossed the distance before the barrel aligned and struck decisively. The trench was cleared within seconds by follow-on troops. No pause, no consolidation. Speed prevented recovery. He redirected 2 sections toward the coastal artillery emplacement overlooking the approach channel. The guns, if left operational, could devastate the remaining landing craft. The climb was steep and slick with frost. German rifle fire intensified from a stone bunker above. Churchill did not waste time trading long-range shots. He maneuvered left along a rock shelf, using terrain to mask movement. At less than 20 meters, grenades went in first. The explosion stunned the defenders. Churchill entered immediately after detonation, sword in hand, followed by 2 commandos covering with automatic fire. The bunker was secured in under a minute. Survivors were disarmed and sent downslope under guard. By 9:03, the primary shore battery was neutralized. Demolition charges were placed on the artillery pieces. Secondary positions were collapsing under coordinated assault across the island. The German response never stabilized. What had been designed as a defensive strongpoint became a fragmented series of isolated fights. Churchill moved continuously between sectors, reinforcing weak points, redirecting fire teams, ensuring momentum never slowed. 10 minutes after first contact, The crest of the island was in British hands. But the fight was not finished. Across the narrow channel, the main town objective was reporting heavier resistance than expected. German reinforcements had arrived overnight. Street fighting had begun. Churchill did not wait for formal reassignment. He gathered a reinforced section, boarded a landing craft, and crossed under sporadic fire toward the secondary objective. Smoke hung low over rooftops. Snipers were firing from upper windows. British commandos were pinned behind stone walls, unable to push forward through intersecting machine gun lanes. Churchill assessed quickly. A frontal push down the main street would bleed men without guarantee of breakthrough. He led a flanking movement through a narrow side alley, partially shielded from direct fire. Grenades cleared the first corner. Automatic bursts suppressed the second. Churchill advanced at the front, directing movement with short, sharp commands. The sudden pressure from the flank forced German defenders to split attention. Within minutes, the defensive line fractured. British forces pushed into the center of town, clearing structures room by room. The fighting lasted into mid-afternoon. Demolition teams destroyed targeted industrial facilities. Documents were seized. Over 100 German prisoners were taken before extraction. 17 British commandos were killed. Dozens wounded. Churchill emerged physically uninjured. His sword bore marks of use. His men no longer questioned his methods. The raid sent a message beyond the immediate tactical success. German High Command reinforced Norwegian coastal defenses in response, diverting thousands of troops to guard against further attacks. A single commando strike had forced strategic redistribution of enemy forces. Churchill's reputation spread rapidly through British ranks, not as a curiosity, but as an officer who delivered results through audacity and timing. This was no longer an experiment in unconventional warfare. It was proof. July 11th, 1943, eastern Sicily. The Allied invasion had begun 2 days earlier, under heavy seas and scattered coordination. By the time Churchill and No. 2 Commando pushed inland from the coast, resistance was already organized and deliberate. This was not Norway. Here, the ground rose sharply into dry ridgelines and stone villages built for defense. German paratroopers reinforced Italian units, turning crossroads into kill zones and hilltops into artillery observation posts. Churchill came ashore with the same combination he had carried before: broadswords secured, automatic weapons slung, grenades at his belt. His men no longer smirked at the sword. They had seen it used. The objective was a road junction controlling movement toward Catania. German forces had established machine gun nests overlooking the approach, supported by mortars firing from reverse slopes. A direct advance would stall under crossfire. Churchill studied the terrain through field glasses. The main road was covered. The obvious ravine was pre-registered for mortar fire, but a narrow agricultural path cut behind a stone terrace to the west. Steep, exposed in sections, but partially masked from the main gun line. He divided his force. One section would maintain visible pressure from the road, drawing sustained fire. Churchill led the flanking element. The climb was punishing under summer heat. Dust rose with every step. Twice, mortar rounds walked closer as German spotters adjusted range. Churchill kept the pace steady. No sprinting, no panic. At less than 30 yards from the crest, he signaled halt. Voices carried from the German position above. Relaxed, confident, focused downslope. They believed the British were still pinned on the road. Churchill pulled a grenade, counted the seconds, and threw high over the terrace lip. The detonation broke the rhythm of the gun. He moved immediately. The first German gunner attempted to pivot his weapon toward the flank. Churchill closed before he could depress the barrel. A single strike ended the motion. Behind him, Commandos poured controlled fire into the remaining crew. The mortar team attempted to reposition. Rifle shots cut them down as they scrambled for cover. The entire assault on the hilltop lasted under 3 minutes. From the captured elevation, Churchill redirected the machine gun toward retreating defenders along the road. What had been a fortified choke point became an exposed withdrawal route. By late afternoon, the junction was secured. Casualties were present, but limited. German resistance in the immediate sector collapsed back toward secondary lines. Churchill did not celebrate. He knew the pattern now, yet success invited counterattack. Within 48 hours, No. 2 Commando was redeployed again, this time to mainland Italy. The landing at Salerno in September 1943 would prove more dangerous than Sicily. Intelligence underestimated German readiness. Panzer units and artillery were already positioned to strike the beaches. Churchill's unit was assigned to hold a critical high-ground town overlooking the western edge of the beachhead. If it fell, German guns could range the landing zones directly. For 5 days, his men held against repeated counterattacks. Tanks probed the perimeter. Mortars hammered rooftops. Ammunition ran low more than once. Churchill moved continuously between positions, reinforcing weak sectors, steadying younger soldiers under pressure. He understood something that had become central to his command style. Bravery inspires briefly. Stability keeps men fighting. Then came orders for a night action against an observation post, directing German artillery fire onto Allied lines. A large assault would be detected. Churchill chose 2 men. Under cover of darkness, they moved through drainage ditches and stone walls toward the enemy-held height. Cigarette embers gave away the first mortar crew's position. Churchill stepped from shadow into their line of sight. Sword visible, voice calm, revolver steady. Hands up. Shock works at close range. The first crew surrendered. Using their own belts and equipment, Churchill secured them and advanced to the next position. The process repeated. Surprise, command presence, controlled threat. By dawn, over 30 German soldiers had been disarmed and marched back downhill under escort. The beachhead held. Churchill received another decoration. The official citation referenced leadership and initiative. It did not mention the sword, but the legend continued to grow. The war was shifting eastward now. Italy was not the final test. April 1944, Adriatic coast. By the time Churchill and his commandos were reassigned to support Yugoslav partisan operations, the war had shifted into a brutal phase of occupation and counterinsurgency. German forces controlled cities and transport routes. The mountains belonged to guerrillas. No front lines, no safe rear. Churchill's detachment operated from island staging points, launching raids against supply depots and coastal garrisons. Early operations were efficient. Short strikes, rapid withdrawal, prisoners taken when possible. German command adapted quickly. Patrol strength increased. High ground was reinforced. Mortar teams were positioned to cover likely landing zones. In early May, Churchill received orders to assist in seizing a German-held island, dominating key shipping lanes. Intelligence suggested a reinforced garrison, elevated defensive positions, and pre-sighted mortar ranges. He landed at night with a mixed force, British commandos and local partisans. Coordination was fragile from the start. Signals were delayed, assault timing slipped. By dawn, German units occupied the surrounding heights. Mortar fire began landing at roughly 600 meters, adjusting inward with disciplined precision. Stone shattered. Casualties mounted within minutes. Churchill assessed the slope ahead. A frontal climb would cost the unit everything. Machine guns covered the obvious approach. Mortars bracketed open ground. He chose movement over stubbornness. To the west, a narrow stone defile cut between ridgelines. Steep, uneven, difficult to traverse under fire. Precisely the sort of terrain German commanders would consider unlikely for organized withdrawal. He ordered retreat through the pass. Several wounded could not move unassisted. Carrying them would slow the column and expose the entire unit longer under fire. Leaving them would improve survival odds. Churchill made the decision without hesitation. No one stays. Improvised stretchers were formed from rifles and cloaks. The column entered the defile under intermittent machine gun bursts. German infantry began advancing from the crest, sensing collapse. A forward German element attempted to cut off the withdrawal at the mouth of the pass. Churchill redirected a rear guard to delay them. Ammunition was nearly depleted. He remained with the covering element while the main body moved with the wounded. Short controlled bursts conserved rounds. Grenades were used sparingly. German pressure increased as they realized the British were attempting breakout rather than surrender. Within minutes, magazines ran dry. Churchill checked his remaining ammunition, nearly gone. He slung the weapon and drew the broadsword. When German infantry closed the distance to under 10 meters inside the confined rock corridor, Churchill stepped forward rather than backward. The terrain restricted rifle maneuver. Surprise and aggression replaced firepower. The first German fell before properly shouldering his weapon. A second hesitated, unsure how to react in terrain too tight for formation. Commandos beside Churchill engaged at point-blank range. The clash was violent and compressed. Then a grenade landed near the rock wall. The blast threw Churchill backward. Sound collapsed into silence. When he regained awareness, his hands were empty. His sword was gone. His men were either fallen or disarmed. German soldiers stood over him, weapons leveled. For the first time since 1940, Jack Churchill was not choosing the next move. He had been captured. May 1944. Churchill regained consciousness with his wrists bound and German soldiers standing over him. The battle on the rocky slopes was over. His remaining commandos had been killed, wounded, or scattered. He had led from the front for 4 years. Now he was a prisoner. The Germans quickly realized his name. Churchill was not common in British ranks, and rumors of a sword-carrying commando had circulated widely. He was separated from other captives and transported under guard for interrogation. Berlin first. Questions followed. Was he related to the British Prime Minister? Did he possess strategic knowledge? Was he part of a larger infiltration plan? The answers disappointed them. He was not connected to political command. He held no grand operational secrets. He was a field officer who had fought aggressively and unconventionally. That made him dangerous, but not valuable. He was transferred to Sachsenhausen, a high-security concentration facility north of Berlin, used for prominent prisoners and political detainees. The environment was controlled, restrictive, and lethal over time. Churchill did not adjust to captivity quietly. He studied guard rotations, fence lines, watchtower blind spots. He spoke with other Allied officers housed in the same section. Among them were Royal Air Force men who had already attempted escape from other camps. Within weeks, a plan formed. Using crude tools and improvised concealment, Churchill and a small group began digging from a drainage point near the perimeter. Work was done at night, dirt hidden under garden soil and refuse. The tunnel extended over 100 meters beneath fencing and patrol lanes. In late September 1944, Churchill and 4 others crawled through the passage and emerged beyond the outer wire. They moved at night, heading north toward the Baltic coast, with the intention of reaching neutral territory. They carried no maps, limited food, and no reliable identification. For nearly 2 weeks, they evaded capture. They avoided roads, stole vegetables from fields, and slept in ditches. Germany, however, was saturated with patrols. Near the coast, they were stopped by a German unit conducting identity checks. Without documents, they were detained and recognized as escaped prisoners. Churchill was returned to confinement, this time deeper into Austria, in a mountain camp intended to prevent further attempts. Winter set in. Allied forces were advancing from both east and west. Bombers crossed overhead daily. German authority was fraying. In April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, Churchill and other prominent prisoners were moved south toward the Tyrol region of Italy. The SS intended to use them as bargaining leverage. The situation deteriorated rapidly. German army officers, unwilling to see prisoners executed in a final act of desperation, intervened. The SS Guard withdrew under pressure. Churchill and over 100 other detainees were effectively abandoned in an Alpine village. Most prisoners waited for Allied troops. Churchill did not. He began walking south, alone. With no weapon, no official papers, and minimal food, he covered roughly 150 kilometers across mountain terrain over several days. He avoided retreating German units and searched for Allied patrols. Eventually, near Verona, he encountered American armored reconnaissance elements advancing north. The Americans were initially skeptical of the disheveled British officer claiming to be a lieutenant colonel and commando leader. He had no proof, only his account. It was enough. Churchill was processed, confirmed through channels, and returned to British control. The war in Europe ended weeks later. For nearly a year, he had fought, escaped, been recaptured, and marched across enemy territory without once abandoning the instinct to act rather than wait. But the war was not entirely finished. The Pacific Theater remained active. Japan still held territory. Churchill requested reassignment. He intended to fight again. August 1945. Jack Churchill was en route to the Far East when the war changed overnight. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Within weeks, Japan surrendered. Churchill had requested transfer to continue fighting. Instead, he found himself arriving in a theater that no longer required invasion. The final campaign he had prepared for would never happen. For a man who had spent years in constant motion, landing on hostile shores, charging fortified positions, escaping prison camps, the sudden silence of victory felt unnatural. He remained in service briefly, assigned to administrative and transitional duties. The British Army, shifting from global war to peacetime restructuring, had limited use for officers who thrived in chaos. Churchill's record was undeniable. He had fought in France, Norway, Sicily, mainland Italy, and Yugoslavia. He had led from the front in amphibious assaults. He had captured prisoners in close combat. He had escaped from a concentration camp and walked across enemy territory to rejoin Allied forces. But post-war military life required paperwork, patience, and hierarchy. He adapted where necessary. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, simply to test himself again. He trained younger soldiers in commando doctrine. Speed, aggression, independence. Yet the era that had shaped him was ending. He retired from the British Army in the late 1950s with the rank of lieutenant colonel. For many, that would have been the quiet close of an extraordinary life. Not for Churchill. In civilian life, he pursued new challenges with the same restless energy. He experimented with river surfing on the Severn Bore in England, becoming one of the first in the country to ride the tidal wave upstream. He built and piloted model warships. He refurbished boats and navigated English waterways for pleasure rather than war. He continued playing the bagpipes at military gatherings, not as spectacle, but as memory. Those who met him later in life often struggled to reconcile the calm, courteous man before them with the officer who had charged beaches under artillery fire. Churchill himself did not romanticize his past. He spoke about the war plainly when asked, without exaggeration. He did not claim to have changed the course of the conflict. He did not pretend that a sword or a bow could defeat tanks or aircraft. What he demonstrated was something narrower and perhaps more enduring. Modern warfare is industrial. It is logistical. It is dominated by machines. But at the smallest level, in a trench, on a hillside, inside a bunker, it still comes down to individuals making decisions under pressure. Churchill's weapons were unconventional. His methods were often theatrical, but his results were tactical, measurable, and real. He understood shock. He understood timing. He understood that hesitation can be created and exploited. Jack Churchill died in 1996 at the age of 89. He outlived most of the men who fought beside him. He outlived the regime he battled. He outlived the century that tried to make men like him obsolete. He was never the most decorated officer of the war. He did not command divisions. He did not draft grand strategy. But in moments that required action rather than theory, he stepped forward. A bow in 1940, a sword in 1941, a defiant stand in 1944, and a refusal, always. To accept that fear should dictate behavior. If you want more stories about real soldiers, unconventional tactics, and the individuals who refused to fight by the book, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button so this story reaches more people. And stay with us, because history still has battles left to uncover.